Can you imagine an expert hunter bringing down a massive animal, only to be mocked by the entire camp and possibly walk away with nothing? It sounds absurd. He has just risked his life and returned with enough food to feed many people, yet instead of being celebrated, he might be laughed at around the fire. But that was the world our ancestors lived in, a world shaped by rules that can seem almost impossible to understand today. Ancient humans were not completely free to wander beneath the open sky and do whatever they pleased. To survive among dangerous animals, hunger, cold, and an unforgiving landscape, small groups often depended on strict social rules that many modern people would find extremely difficult to accept.
Rules nobody could escape.
What makes these rules even more fascinating is that no king created them, and no stone tablet listed what people could or could not do. They grew out of hunger, cold, danger, and the constant pressure of survival. In the wild, a group with no order could disappear faster than one burdened by too many rules. So these customs became survival tools, helping small communities function as a single unit. And unlike modern societies, which often place great importance on individual rights, many of these rules were designed first and foremost to protect the group. You could be stronger, smarter, or more skilled than everyone else, but that did not automatically give you the right to stand above them. But that creates an obvious problem. How do you make people follow the rules when there are no police officers, courts, or prisons? The answer was surprisingly simple and incredibly powerful. Constant talk around the campfire. If someone took too much food, people knew. If someone refused to help, people knew. If someone started bragging, the entire camp could hear about it. Community opinion and group judgment became an extremely effective form of social control. In a small band, there was almost nowhere for your reputation to hide. Breaking the rules did not just mean being embarrassed. It could mean pushing yourself outside the only network of protection that stood between you and death. And that brings us to the first rule, involving one of the most valuable things in the ancient world: meat. Imagine tracking an animal for hours, moving through brush and rough ground, and finally risking everything to bring it down. You might assume the best cut belongs to you. Not necessarily. In some hunter-gatherer societies, the animal was not considered the property of the person who fired the weapon, but of the person who owned the arrow that struck it. That could create a strange situation in which the most skilled hunter in the group killed the largest animal of the day, yet still received no special reward and perhaps no more meat than anyone else. Why would anyone create a system like that? Because hunting weapons and arrows were often borrowed, exchanged, and passed between people. The arrow in a hunter's quiver might actually belong to someone who never joined the hunt at all. Its owner could be an elderly woman who could no longer travel far, or a young boy who was still too small to hunt. Suddenly, someone who never stepped onto the hunting ground could have an important role in deciding how the meat was distributed through camp. It sounds backwards, but that was exactly the point. A system like this made it harder for elite hunters to accumulate too much influence or turn their success into permanent authority. Hunting skill mattered, but it did not easily become political power. There was also a much more practical reason for sharing. Ancient people could not store fresh food as easily as we can today. There were no refrigerators and no modern preservation systems waiting back at camp. Sharing therefore became a form of insurance. You fed other people today so they could feed you when your own hunt failed tomorrow. Hunting was always uncertain. Even a highly skilled hunter could return empty-handed again and again. One day you were lucky, the next day someone else was. By spreading meat through the group, people were effectively storing food in the safest places available, in other people's stomachs, and in the social obligations created by sharing. They had no bank account, but they did have a kind of social insurance built out of meat. Even bringing home an impressive animal did not give you permission to walk around like a hero. If a hunter started bragging about his success, the rest of the group might immediately cut him back down to size. They could complain that the animal was skinny, weak, or hardly worth carrying home. This practice is often described as insulting the meat. A successful hunter was expected to stay modest, lower his head, agree with the criticism, and sometimes even apologize instead of boasting about what he had done. The most striking part is the timing. The teasing came at the exact moment of success, almost as if the group wanted to crush pride before it had a chance to grow. That may sound harsh, but in a small community with no castles, armies, or formal government, ridicule could help protect equality. If the strongest, most successful, or most talented person began believing he deserved to command everyone else, the entire balance of the group could change. Pride was therefore treated as more than an annoying personality trait. It could become a threat to cooperation. Humor and teasing pulled high-status individuals back down to the same level as everyone else, reminding them that skill did not make them superior. Before anyone could declare himself the boss, the group already had a powerful way to shrink his ego. But what happened if teasing was not enough? Then the group could turn to something more serious: quiet isolation. There did not need to be a formal sentence or a locked cell. People could simply stop listening to you, stop sitting near you, stop asking for your opinion, or even move their shelters farther away. In a modern city, being ignored might be painful or frustrating. In a small community surrounded by wilderness, it could be terrifying. No matter how strong or capable one person was, surviving completely alone was extremely difficult. Social isolation therefore did more than damage someone's reputation. It could threaten that person's very ability to stay alive.
Babies belonged to everyone.
From there, we move to a rule that may feel even more uncomfortable to modern people. Your baby was not entirely yours alone. After birth, a mother was not necessarily expected to keep her child constantly beside her in complete privacy. A newborn could quickly pass into the arms of other people in camp, who might hold, watch, comfort, and help care for the child. In some communities, infants could even be breastfed by women other than their biological mothers. To us, that can seem as if the boundaries of the family are being blurred. To our ancestors, however, shared childcare could be part of a larger survival system. And that leads to an even bigger question. Why did raising one human child require the support of an entire group? Human children are among the most demanding young in the natural world because they are born helpless and remain dependent for years. A baby cannot find food, escape danger, stay warm, or protect itself without help. This is where shared childcare became an enormous advantage. A mother did not have to gather food while carrying and watching several young children entirely on her own, because grandmothers, aunts, and other women could help. When the mother was away looking for food, someone else could hold the child. When she was exhausted, another caregiver could step in. Sharing the work of raising children may also have allowed mothers to have children closer together. In that sense, cooperative childcare became one of the important strategies that helped human communities grow and survive. But this system had a much harsher side when a group faced severe famine. If food was disappearing and everyone was already exhausted from migration, decisions about whether the group could support another dependent member could become a collective matter rather than a purely private family choice. Under extreme conditions, the survival needs of the entire group could take priority over individual wishes. To modern people, that idea can be deeply disturbing. But for a small band crossing a dry landscape, every person required food, water, and energy to keep moving. Survival could become a brutal calculation. If the demands on the group exceeded what its resources could support, everyone might be placed at greater risk. And if that still does not show how different ancient life could be, imagine something much simpler. Living your entire life with almost no privacy. Eating, sleeping, arguing, grieving, and celebrating could all happen within sight or earshot of everyone around you. Shelters were often close together and offered nothing like the thick walls, locked doors, and private rooms of a modern home. If two people argued at night, the rest of the camp might know about it by morning. If someone was angry, miserable, or avoiding work, it could be difficult to hide. Privacy, at least in the form many of us expect today, was far more limited in the daily life of small ancient communities. That lack of separation also created an extremely powerful system of social control. Everyone could quickly learn who was lazy, dishonest, generous, selfish, or unreliable because stories about people traveled constantly through the camp. Someone who refused to share food in the afternoon might become the subject of conversation that evening. Someone caught lying in the morning could lose credibility before the day was over. Campfire talk worked almost like a constantly updating record of everyone's reputation. And when mistakes were difficult to hide, people had a strong reason to behave in ways that protected one of their most valuable social assets: the trust of the group. The problem was that in a small community, A damaged reputation was not easy to escape. A foolish mistake made when you were young could become a nickname or story that followed you for years. There was no delete button, and no nearby city where you could simply move and introduce yourself to strangers who knew nothing about your past. Constant ridicule could feel like a punishment with no clear ending. Worse, someone with a bad reputation might be excluded from hunting partnerships or receive less support from others. Even their family could suffer socially. In a world where survival depended heavily on cooperation, reputation was not just about pride. It could determine who was willing to stand beside you when life became difficult.
Nobody was left behind.
Yet there is another side of ancient life that is easy to misunderstand. People sometimes imagine that early humans simply abandoned anyone who was badly injured or disabled. Archaeological evidence suggests a more complicated and often more compassionate picture. Shanidar I, a Neanderthal individual, lived with several serious physical impairments, including major damage to one eye, the loss of part of one arm, and problems that would have made movement difficult. Yet he survived for years after suffering those injuries. That strongly suggests he was not surviving entirely on his own. Other people likely helped provide food, protection, and support. Even in a harsh environment, caring for vulnerable members could be part of how a group survived. But why would a group invest so much effort in someone who could no longer hunt as effectively? Because in a world without books, older and less mobile people could serve as priceless living libraries. Imagine a drought unlike anything the younger members had ever seen. Familiar streams have dried up, and no one knows where to find water. An older person might remember that decades earlier, during another terrible drought, the group survived by traveling to a distant valley where water remained. A memory like that could save lives. Older people could also watch children, maintain campfires, teach toolmaking, and pass on knowledge gathered over a lifetime. A weaker body did not mean a useless person. Even so, support was not always viewed as an automatic right with no expectations attached. In a world where everyone depended on everyone else, the way a person treated the group over many years could affect how others treated that person later. Someone known for being selfish, refusing to help, and contributing very little might find that goodwill disappeared when conditions became severe. During a difficult migration, people had to decide whom they could physically support and how much weight the group could carry. If someone had completely lost the trust and support of everyone around them, others might refuse to take responsibility for helping that person continue. In the open wilderness, losing the support of the group could seriously reduce a person's chances of survival. The next rule is one that many modern people would reject immediately. You might not have been completely free to choose whom you married. In many ancient societies, marriages could be arranged by families long before the couple had much say in the matter. Young girls might be promised to boys or men from another group while still very young. Personal attraction was not always the most important consideration. Individual feelings could be pushed aside in favor of decisions that served the wider interests of the family. Marriage was not simply about two people falling in love. It could connect two families, and sometimes two entire communities living in different territories. Why would families take control of such a personal decision? Because marriage could create alliances that improved everyone's chances of survival. If your own territory suffered a drought, relatives connected through marriage might allow your family to seek refuge on their land. If tension developed between two groups, marriage ties could make open conflict less likely. In this way, marriage expanded a family's survival network far beyond its closest blood relatives. To many ancient communities, a decision with consequences that large was simply too important to leave entirely to the changing emotions of a young person. Love was not always treated as a private matter between two individuals. It could also become part of a wider strategy for keeping families and communities connected.
You couldn't keep everything.
Now imagine spending days making a beautiful necklace. You carefully choose every piece, string everything together, and finally think, "This is mine." Then someone in camp walks over and asks for it. In many small-scale societies, clinging too tightly to personal possessions could be seen as selfish or antisocial. If another person genuinely needed something or simply asked for it, you might feel strong pressure to hand it over without making a scene. Refusing could damage more than one relationship. It might make the entire group see you as greedy. And in a small community, losing the respect and support of others could be far more dangerous than losing a necklace. Rules like this kept possessions moving from person to person and made it harder for anyone to accumulate far more than everyone else. But gift giving could become even stranger. You were not always expected to immediately return something of equal value. That seems completely backwards to modern ideas about fairness. Today, when someone helps us, we often want to repay them quickly so we no longer feel indebted. But in some gift exchange systems, settling the debt too quickly could suggest that you wanted to end the relationship. Instead, a gift might remain unanswered for a while, with another gift given later in a different form. That period of unfinished obligation helped keep the connection alive. As long as something remained to be repaid, both sides had another reason to remember, visit, and help each other. The gift was more than an object. It became an invisible thread tying people together. Those social ties also had to remain flexible, because ancient groups did not always stay together in the same size throughout the year. When food was plentiful, several families might gather into a larger camp to eat, trade, exchange news, and spend time together. But when the dry season arrived and resources became scarce, the large group could split into smaller bands again. Some people might move toward a river, others follow migrating animals, while another group searched for areas where plants were still available. Joining together and separating again according to the season helped prevent too many people from exhausting the resources of a single place. That also meant possessions had to remain light and portable. A house packed with furniture and heavy belongings would have been a serious problem for people who needed to move whenever conditions changed. Being able to leave easily solved another problem as well: conflict. When two people became locked in a serious dispute, the solution did not always have to involve the whole camp deciding who was right and who was wrong. Sometimes people could simply separate. Part of the group might gather its belongings and move somewhere else. Once two people who could not stand each other no longer had to meet every day, the conflict could lose its intensity. This freedom to leave also limited the power of bullies. Someone could shout orders, threaten others, and imagine that he was becoming the leader. But if everyone else could simply pick up their belongings and walk away, his authority disappeared with them. A boss with nobody left to command was not much of a boss at all. But what if someone continued threatening or harming others even after repeated warnings? Without prisons, professional guards, or a formal justice system, a group might eventually turn to its most serious response: expulsion. Removing a dangerous person from the community could become a last resort when other forms of pressure had failed. In the ancient wilderness, however, exile meant losing access to shared food, hunting partners, protection, and the daily cooperation that made survival possible. That could drastically reduce a person's chances of staying alive. For that reason, such decisions were not necessarily made casually. In small communities, removing someone who posed a serious threat could require broad agreement after repeated discussion, because everyone understood that a reckless decision could divide the entire group. In some societies, even the responsibility for carrying out the most serious punishment could fall on a relative of the person being punished. That sounds extraordinarily harsh, but the logic was partly about preventing generations of revenge. If an outsider caused the death of a condemned person, that person's relatives might feel obligated to retaliate. Then the other family could respond, and a single conflict might grow into a cycle that involved everyone. But if the family itself accepted the community's decision and took responsibility for carrying it out, there was less reason to seek revenge against another family. It was a painful solution, but the larger purpose was to prevent one act of punishment from turning into an endless feud that could tear the community apart.
Living with the dead.
Then we reach one of the most difficult customs for modern people to understand. At a cave in England, archaeologists discovered human skulls that had been carefully shaped into cup-like objects around 14,700 years ago. The bones had been deliberately worked and modified, showing that this was not simply a random act. From a modern perspective, using human remains in this way can feel deeply unfamiliar. But in some ancient cultures, treating the remains of the dead could have carried meanings connected to memory, ritual, or continuing bonds with the deceased. In some Amazonian communities, the remains of deceased relatives have also played a role in mourning rituals intended to keep the dead connected to the living community. What appears disturbing from one cultural perspective may have represented closeness, remembrance, or respect from another. For many ancient people, death did not necessarily mean that a family member disappeared completely from everyday life. In some communities, the dead were buried very close to living spaces, sometimes beneath houses or other areas where families continued their daily activities. From their perspective, sending someone far away and never remaining physically close to them might have seemed stranger than keeping them nearby. The dead had changed their state of existence, but they could still remain part of family memory and identity. Preserved or decorated human remains could also serve as reminders of ancestry for later generations. This reveals a major difference between many modern societies and some ancient ones. We often create physical distance between the living and the dead, while some earlier communities found ways to keep the dead close. And when we look back at all 10 of these remarkable rules, a pattern begins to appear. Meat was redistributed so successful hunters could not easily control everyone else. Pride was mocked so talented individuals could not turn themselves into permanent bosses. Children were cared for collectively so one family did not have to carry the entire burden alone. Possessions kept moving through gifts, making it harder to accumulate too much wealth. Even the freedom to leave the group prevented bullies from trapping others beneath their authority. These rules may seem unrelated at first, but many of them point toward the same larger principle. No single person should be allowed to rise too far above everyone else. What makes this especially interesting is that even though we now live behind locked doors, own private possessions, keep personal accounts, and make many decisions for ourselves, something of that older logic may still remain in the way we respond to unfairness. In the well-known ultimatum game, one person proposes how to divide a sum of money, while the other person can either accept the offer or reject it. If the proposed split is extremely unequal, people sometimes reject the offer even though doing so means they receive nothing. Imagine being offered $5 while the other person keeps $95 and deciding that you would rather lose your $5 than allow the unfair split to stand. That reaction suggests that fairness can matter to us even when defending it comes at a personal cost. Perhaps our anger at unfairness is a distant echo of a world in which equality within the group was not merely a moral preference, but part of survival itself. And perhaps every time we resent seeing one person take far more than everyone else, we are hearing a very old warning. Do not let one person rise too far above the rest.